You think Anne Boleyn died with one clean stroke of a sword. Think again. Her execution was one of the most horrifying in history, not for the blade alone, but for the humiliation, the betrayal, and the spectacle that surrounded it. Tonight, we reveal how a queen who once sat on England's throne was dragged into a trial she could never win, accused of crimes she never committed, and forced to wait as her death was prepared, like a performance. This wasn't justice. It was theatre. And the sickest twist? The ending had been decided long before she stepped onto the scaffold. What if the horror of Anne Boleyn's execution didn't begin with the sword but with the whispers? Because Anne's downfall wasn't sudden. It was carefully scripted, step by step, until escape became impossible. The sickest twist. The queen who once dazzled Henry VIII, who he risked a kingdom to marry, was now treated as if she were poison in his veins. The accusations started quietly. Adultery, witchcraft, even incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. Can you imagine hearing your name tied to such grotesque lies, knowing that once they spread, no truth could ever wash them away? It wasn't about evidence, it was about destroying her completely. Henry wanted freedom, and Anne had to pay for it. Her arrest was staged for maximum humiliation. She was dragged from her chambers in Greenwich, stripped of her titles, her jewels seized. The woman who had once ruled as queen now rode through the streets as a prisoner, the eyes of London fixed on her fall. And the darker truth, the people whispered that she deserved it not because they believed it, but because fear taught them to. Who would defend her when the king had already decided her fate? Inside the Tower of London, Anne was locked in the same rooms where she had once celebrated her coronation. Can you picture that? Sleeping in the very place where her glory had begun, now awaiting her ruin. Every corridor echoed with betrayal. Every day brought her closer to the scaffold. Anne's horror wasn't just the thought of dying. It was the knowledge that she was being erased. Her enemies weren't satisfied with her life. They wanted her dignity, her legacy, her very name. And the worst part? The blade hadn't even been lifted yet. What if your trial was never about guilt or innocence, but about putting on a show? That was the nightmare Anne Boleyn stepped into in May 1536. Her trial wasn't a chance to clear her name. It was a stage, packed with enemies, where the ending had already been written. The charges against her were staggering: adultery with multiple men, treason against the crown, even incest with her brother George. Think about that, the Queen of England, accused of crimes so grotesque that her very reputation was shredded before the verdict was read. The evidence? Lies, forced confessions, twisted timelines. Anne was accused of being in two places at once. Witnesses were men broken under torture, their words shaped into daggers by the king's will. The dark truth was simple. Facts didn't matter, the performance did. The trial took place in London's Great Hall, a space vast enough to hold thousands. Nobles, courtiers, and even commoners crowded in. They weren't there for justice, they were there for spectacle. Can you imagine walking into a room where every eye waits to see you fall? Anne entered without her crown, dressed in a plain gown. Yet even then, she carried herself with dignity. She denied every charge, her voice steady, her words defiant. But in a court ruled by Henry's will, even courage became evidence of guilt. The testimonies came like waves: servants, courtiers, and finally her own brother George, accused of the unthinkable. The jury listened, not to weigh the truth, but to nod at the performance, because the sickest twist was this: Anne was not really on trial. The idea of her was. The trial existed to destroy her name so completely that her death would look like justice, not murder. The verdict came quickly, too quickly. Guilty on all counts. Anne was sentenced to death, but the form of her execution was left in Henry's hands. Would she be burned alive? Beheaded by the axe? Her punishment was not law. It was whim. Her fate hung not on evidence, but on her husband's mood. As Anne was led back to her chambers in the Tower, the crowd buzzed with whispers. Some pitied her. Most stayed silent, because everyone knew the darker truth. This wasn't justice. This was a performance written by Henry VIII, with Anne cast as the villain. And the next act was her death. What if the cruelest part of execution wasn't the blade but the waiting? For Anne Boleyn, the real horror began not when the sentence was pronounced, but in the days that followed, locked inside the Tower of London, forced to count down the hours of her life. The sickest twist? Even the waiting was turned into torture. Anne was confined in the royal apartments of the Tower, the same rooms where she had once celebrated her coronation only 3 years before. Can you imagine the psychological torment? To walk the same halls where your triumph had begun, knowing they would now be the setting of your ruin. Outside, she could hear the construction of the scaffold, each hammer blow echoing like a countdown to her death. And then came the delays. First, she was told she would die on one day. Then the execution was postponed, then moved again. What could be more horrifying than preparing yourself for death, saying your final prayers, steeling your nerves only to wake up alive, forced to relive the terror all over again? It was psychological torment carefully staged to break her. Every sunrise became a reminder that her end had only been delayed, not avoided. Yet Anne did not collapse. Even in the Tower, she showed a strange calmness, even flashes of dark humor. She told her attendants that she would soon be called Queen Anne No Head. Was it courage? Was it despair? Or was it her final act of defiance to laugh in the face of a king who wanted her destroyed? That composure unsettled her enemies more than tears ever could. But make no mistake, Anne was utterly alone. Henry refused to see her. The man who had once torn apart England to marry her now pretended she did not exist. Her daughter, Elizabeth, was taken from her, her future uncertain. Former friends stayed silent, unwilling to risk their lives for hers. Isn't that more terrifying than death itself, to realize that in your final days, love, loyalty, and power have all evaporated into silence? Then came the final, chilling decision. Henry ordered that Anne be granted a mercy. She would not burn at the stake. Instead, he brought in a swordsman from Calais, a French expert known for his clean, swift strikes. But here's the darkest truth: it wasn't kindness. It was theater. Anne's death had to be unique, memorable, a performance fit for the queen who had once defied the Pope. Even in execution, she would not be ordinary. So Anne waited. Day after day, she prayed. She confessed her innocence. She prepared herself. The court outside already moved on, celebrating Jane Seymour, Henry's new bride-to-be. What could be more horrifying than knowing you were being erased not for your crimes, but for the convenience of a king who had already chosen your replacement? The night before her death, Anne remained calm, even serene. Some said she seemed almost relieved, as if the endless waiting had become worse than the death itself. And perhaps that is the cruelest twist of all, that Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, met her execution not with fear, but with relief. Because death was the only escape left to her. But the horror wasn't over yet. Because the scaffold itself was waiting. The crowd would gather, the blade would rise, and Anne Boleyn's final moments would become one of the most haunting executions in history. What if the execution of Anne Boleyn wasn't just an ending but a performance scripted to terrify everyone who watched? On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne walked out of her chambers in the Tower of London for the last time. She was only 35 years old, a queen reduced to a prisoner, a woman about to meet her end. The sickest twist? She knew she was innocent, but she also knew innocence no longer mattered. The sun was bright that morning, unusually clear for London. As Anne stepped outside, the air must have felt sharp, every sound magnified. The scaffold stood ready, a wooden stage surrounded by guards and packed with spectators. Nobles, ambassadors, curious commoners, they were all there to witness the death of a queen. Can you imagine the silence that fell as she appeared? The crowd leaning forward, desperate to see what horror looked like in silk and dignity. Anne wore a dark gown, her hair tucked under a headdress, and over her shoulders she draped a cloak of ermine. She carried herself with calm, walking steadily up the steps of the scaffold. Even now, she refused to break. What kind of strength does it take to walk toward your own death with grace, when the man who condemned you isn't even there to watch. Henry stayed away, already celebrating Jane Seymour. Anne's death was for his convenience, not his conscience. When she reached the top, Anne turned to the crowd and spoke. Her words were carefully chosen, rehearsed in the long hours of waiting. She did not accuse Henry. She did not proclaim her innocence. Instead, she praised the king, declared herself a faithful wife, and asked the crowd to pray for him. Why? Because in Tudor England, even in death, the queen had to serve the king's image. Isn't that the darkest truth, that her last breath was forced into loyalty for the man who killed her? Yet beneath the formality, her dignity was defiance. By refusing to rage or weep, Anne denied Henry the spectacle of her breaking. The sickest twist was that her composure became her rebellion. The French executioner, brought from Calais, stood ready. He had practiced with his sword, ensuring the strike would be clean. Anne removed her cloak, tucked her hair beneath a linen cap, and knelt upright, not laid down, but tall, proud, on her knees. She began to pray, her lips moving softly. The murmurs of, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul." The crowd held its breath. The executioner raised his sword, but before striking, he called for his assistant to fetch his weapon, a trick to distract Anne. As she turned her head, the blade flashed. In one swift movement, Anne Boleyn's head was severed from her body. There was no scream, no warning, just silence. Then the thud of her head hitting the straw. The crowd gasped. Some wept. Others whispered. But no one spoke too loudly, because they all knew what they had just seen was more than an execution. It was a message. A warning from Henry VIII, written in blood. No one, not even a queen, was safe from the king's will. Anne's body was hurried into a crude coffin, a simple arrow chest from the Tower's storeroom. No ceremony, no royal burial. The woman for whom Henry had torn his country from Rome, for whom he had defied the Pope and reshaped the church, was laid to rest in an old box, buried beneath the floor of St. Peter ad Vincula. Isn't that the final horror? A queen reduced to nothing, erased in the space of a single morning. And yet, even in death, Anne refused to vanish. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would one day rule England as one of its greatest monarchs. The child Henry branded illegitimate became the queen who defined an era. The cruel irony? Henry had tried to erase Anne, but her bloodline outlived him. Her legacy grew stronger, and her death became one of the most haunting executions in history. Anne Boleyn did not just die on May 19, 1536. She became a warning, a ghost, a legend, and her execution remains a reminder of how far power will go to silence the inconvenient. You think Anne Boleyn's execution ended on the scaffold? Think again. The horror didn't stop with the sword. It spread through England, poisoning families, reshaping politics, and haunting Henry VIII's court for years to come. Because Anne's death wasn't only the destruction of a queen, it was the rewriting of history itself. Her allies were ruined, her family disgraced, and her daughter left branded a bastard. And the sickest twist, Henry used her execution not as an ending, but as a beginning, clearing the way for his next marriage as if Anne had never lived at all. What if the true horror of Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't her death, but everything that came after? Because the scaffold didn't just kill a queen. It ripped through her family, her friends, her legacy, leaving wreckage that would take generations to heal. In the days following her beheading, Anne's body was buried in haste under the floor of the Tower Chapel. No royal tomb, no mourning ceremony. A Queen of England laid to rest in a crude wooden chest, hidden as if she were shame itself. Isn't that the final insult, that the woman who once sat on the throne was buried like a secret? But the punishment stretched further. Her brother George, executed alongside her, was erased from records. His name whispered as incestuous villainy. Their parents, the once powerful Boleyns, lived out their remaining years in disgrace. Henry hadn't just killed Anne, he had annihilated her bloodline's reputation. And what of her daughter, Elizabeth? Declared illegitimate, stripped of her place in succession, reduced to the title Lady Elizabeth. Imagine growing up knowing your mother had been executed as a traitor. your name stained by the charges she never escaped. That was Anne's legacy, not the crown she once wore, but the curse Henry had branded onto her child. Yet the sickest twist was how quickly Henry moved on. Within days of Anne's death, Jane Seymour was paraded as his new bride. The court that had watched Anne's fall now celebrated a wedding, the blood on the scaffold barely dry. Isn't that the darkest truth, that her execution was less about justice and more about making room for the next queen? But Anne's ghost refused to stay silent. The horror of her death lingered in the halls of power. Courtiers whispered of her innocence. Ambassadors recorded their unease, and Elizabeth herself would one day rise to reclaim the crown her mother lost. The same child, marked as a bastard, became England's greatest queen. Henry had erased Anne from life, but he couldn't erase her blood from history. The execution of Anne Boleyn was not just a single act of cruelty. It was a chain reaction, a horror that bled into family, politics, and destiny itself. And the cruelest irony, the man who tried to bury her would be remembered most for the wife he destroyed. What if Anne Boleyn's execution didn't just haunt her family but haunted Henry VIII himself? Because no matter how ruthlessly he tried to bury her, the shadow of Anne's death followed him, twisting his reign and poisoning his legacy. The sickest twist. The man who ordered her death could never escape the ghost he created. At first, Henry tried to erase her as quickly as possible. Within days of her beheading, he married Jane Seymour, celebrating as though Anne's blood wasn't still drying on the scaffold. But the haste only deepened the horror. Can you imagine marrying one queen while the body of another lay rotting in a shallow grave below the Tower Chapel? Henry's eagerness revealed the truth. Anne hadn't been executed for justice, but for convenience, and the kingdom noticed. Ambassadors wrote back to their monarchs with unease, some calling the charges against Anne unbelievable, others hinting that Henry had killed an innocent woman. Whispers spread that the execution had been staged not to punish treason, but to make way for Jane. That was the darker truth. Henry had turned justice into theatre, and his people saw through it. But the horror was not only public, it was personal. For the rest of his life, Henry could never fully silence the memory of Anne. Courtiers claimed he avoided speaking her name, that he flew into rages at the mention of her. And yet, her presence lingered everywhere. Isn't that the cruelest fate? To kill someone so completely, only to find them alive in every shadow of your conscience? Even his marriages carried the ghost of Anne. Jane Seymour gave him the son he craved, but she died soon after childbirth. Anne of Cleves was a political match he rejected in disgust. Catherine Howard, like Anne, was executed. Catherine Parr outlived him. It was as if every queen who followed lived in Anne's shadow, reminders of the blood Henry had spilled to chase his desires. And Elizabeth, the daughter Henry had cast aside, became the ultimate reckoning. Declared illegitimate after Anne's death, she was never meant to inherit the throne. But decades later, she rose as Elizabeth I, one of England's greatest monarchs. Can you imagine Henry's horror if he had known? The child of the woman he destroyed outlived his dynasty, outshone his legacy, and turned Anne's bloodline into triumph. But perhaps the deepest torment was spiritual. Henry had once believed Anne was his destiny, that God had chosen her to give him a son. He tore England from the Pope, shattered the church, and waged a religious revolution to have her. And yet, she gave him only Elizabeth, and then her life ended on the scaffold. The sickest twist, Henry's greatest gamble, left him with nothing but guilt and ghosts. By the end of his reign, Henry VIII was a bloated, paranoid tyrant, his body failing, his conscience weighed down by the blood of wives and friends alike. And though he never admitted it, Anne Boleyn's execution remained the wound that never healed the horror that defined him. Because here's the darkest truth. Henry VIII tried to silence Anne with a sword. Instead, he immortalized her. Her death became his legacy. And centuries later, we don't remember Henry for his triumphs. We remember him for the queen he destroyed. What if Anne Boleyn's death didn't end on the scaffold but grew into legend? Because the execution of a queen was never just an event. It was a story retold in whispers, in chronicles, in propaganda, And Anne's end became one of the most haunting spectacles in history. The sickest twist? The legend has outlived the truth. From the moment the sword struck, Anne's death became theatre. Ambassadors sent home reports filled with horror, some sympathetic, others coldly political. Chroniclers described the silence of the crowd, the swiftness of the blade, the Queen's eerie composure. Can you picture it? Thousands of people crammed into London streets, the memory of a woman kneeling upright, lips moving in prayer, and then the sudden flash of steel. That image burned itself into history, a scene too shocking to ever be forgotten. But the retelling quickly turned darker. Henry VIII wanted Anne remembered as a traitor, a witch, a temptress who deserved her fate. Pamphlets and poems painted her as corrupt, guilty of every crime the court had accused her of. Yet the irony is that the more Henry tried to stain her memory, the more her death began to look like martyrdom. Was she really guilty, or had she been destroyed for the king's convenience? The question lingered, unanswered, feeding her legend, and her daughter, Elizabeth, made sure that legend survived. Though Elizabeth rarely spoke of her mother, her reign echoed Anne's memory. Scholars believe Elizabeth wore Anne's ring, which contained a portrait of her. She surrounded herself with women modeled after Anne's boldness. Isn't that the cruelest revenge? That the child Henry branded illegitimate grew up to carry her mother's ghost into the throne room of England itself. Every triumph of Elizabeth's reign whispered Anne's name. Even the Tower of London became part of her legend. For centuries, visitors claimed to see Anne's ghost wandering the corridors, head tucked beneath her arm, her spirit restless. Guards swore they heard her footsteps. Tourists still say her presence lingers. What could be more horrifying than the idea that Anne's execution was so unjust? Her soul itself refused to leave the place where she was betrayed. And the stories didn't stop there. Artists and playwrights retold her fall, twisting it for their own age. Some made her a tragic heroine. Others painted her as the ambitious schemer Henry wanted people to remember. The dark truth? No one could ever agree on who Anne truly was. But everyone agreed on one thing. Her execution was unforgettable. Centuries later, historians still debate the details. Was she truly guilty of anything? Or was her death the most horrifying example of political murder disguised as justice? The very fact that we still ask proves the power of her legend. The sickest twist may be this. Anne Boleyn, silenced in life, has spoken louder in death than Henry VIII ever could have imagined. Her execution became a warning, a story retold again and again, of how power consumes, how love turns to betrayal, how a queen can be destroyed not for her crimes, but for her husband's desire. And in that story lies the horror that endures, not the flash of the sword, but the knowledge that her death was inevitable the moment Henry wanted her gone. Anne Boleyn did not just die. She became a legend. And that legend, born in blood and silence, remains one of the most horrifying tales in history. What if Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't just her tragedy, but the blueprint for every Tudor queen who followed? Because once a king could put his wife on trial, convict her, and cut off her head, no queen in England could ever truly feel safe again. The darkest truth? Anne's death set the precedent, and the scaffold became part of the crown. After Anne, Henry VIII married Jane Seymour. She gave him the son he craved but died soon after childbirth. Her fate was not execution, but her death made Anne's absence sting even sharper. Isn't it horrifying to realize Anne died for nothing more than Henry's impatience when the very next queen gave him what Anne could not? Then came Anne of Cleves. Henry rejected her, calling her the Flanders mare. But instead of execution, she was granted an annulment and lived comfortably. Why? Because Anne Boleyn's execution had already taught the world that killing a queen was a scandal Henry could not repeat so easily. Anne's death haunted every decision that followed, but the horror returned with Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, barely more than a girl. Catherine was accused of adultery just like Anne, and just like Anne, she was dragged to the Tower, tried, condemned, and executed. The sickest twist: Catherine met her end on the same scaffold, her young blood soaking into the same ground where Anne had fallen. Two queens, destroyed by accusations of betrayal, both silenced by Henry's blade. Even Catherine Parr, Henry's last wife, felt the chill. She nearly faced charges of heresy and treason, only narrowly escaping what would have been execution. The precedent was clear. The crown could love you one day and kill you the next. Anne's death shaped the very image of Tudor queenship. To wear the crown was to walk on glass, to live under the shadow of the axe. Every wife after her carried the ghost of her execution. Every courtier remembered the moment a Queen of England knelt in silence and lost her head to the king's will. That was Anne's true legacy, not just Elizabeth, not just the Reformation, but the horror that queens were disposable. Her death was more than an ending. It was a signal, a warning, a curse etched into the Tudor throne. Betrayal, real or imagined, would be paid in blood. What if Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't the end of her story but the beginning of a shadow that has lasted nearly 500 years? Because when the sword struck on May 19, 1536, it didn't just take the head of a queen. It created a legend, one soaked in horror, betrayal, and injustice that still refuses to die. The darkest twist: Henry VIII thought he had silenced her. In truth, he made her immortal. In the immediate aftermath, Anne was buried in haste, placed in a crude arrow chest, and lowered beneath the stones of the Tower Chapel. No monument, no ceremony, no queenly farewell. Isn't it horrifying to imagine? A woman who had worn a crown, buried like a common prisoner, her body hidden as if it were an embarrassment. Henry moved on instantly, marrying Jane Seymour, celebrating as though Anne had been nothing more than an obstacle cleared from his path. But the truth was far messier, far darker. Anne's family fell into disgrace. Her brother George had already been executed alongside her, condemned on the same grotesque charges. Their parents, once powerful courtiers, lived their last years in shame. The Boleyn name spat in whispers across court. The sickest twist was that Henry didn't just kill Anne, he poisoned everything connected to her. And yet, Anne refused to vanish. Her daughter Elizabeth, stripped of legitimacy and declared a bastard, grew up in the shadow of her mother's execution. She was never supposed to inherit the throne. She was never supposed to be more than a forgotten pawn in Henry's broken family tree. But fate has its own sense of vengeance. The child of the woman Henry tried to erase would one day rise as Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, the ruler of an era so powerful it carries her name. Isn't that the cruelest irony? That the bloodline Henry sought to bury became the one that defined England's greatness. But Anne's legacy wasn't only carried in Elizabeth's crown. It lived in whispers, in ghost stories, in legends told through generations. The Tower of London, the site of her fall, became infamous for her restless spirit. Guards claimed to see her walking the corridors, her head tucked beneath her arm. Tourists still say they feel her presence. What could be more chilling than the idea that her execution was so unjust, her spirit refused to leave the place where her blood was spilled? Her story became a cautionary tale, retold in plays, novels, films. Some painted her as a schemer, an ambitious woman who rose too far. Others turned her into a martyr, a victim destroyed by a tyrant's whims. The dark truth: no one could ever agree who Anne truly was. But everyone agreed on one thing: her execution was horrifying. And what of Henry VIII? For all his power, all his wives, all his wars, he is remembered most not for his triumphs but for the queen he destroyed. When people think of Henry, they think of Anne. Isn't that the deepest punishment? That the man who tried to erase her is forever chained to her name. Anne's execution also reshaped the monarchy itself. After her death, queens were no longer untouchable. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, followed the same path, accused, condemned, executed on the same scaffold. Every queen after Anne lived in her shadow, knowing that the crown could become a blade at any moment. Anne's death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a precedent, a curse placed on the Tudor throne. And centuries later, we still return to it. Why? Because her execution was not simply about politics or love. It was about injustice. It was about a woman accused of impossible crimes, betrayed by the man who had once torn apart his kingdom for her. It was about power's ability to destroy truth. Imagine kneeling in silence before a crowd, praying as the executioner stands ready, knowing that you are innocent, that your name will be blackened, that your daughter will be branded a bastard. Imagine knowing that history will not remember your words, only your death. Isn't that the true horror, that Anne Boleyn died not for what she did, but for who she was? And yet, in death, she triumphed, because Anne Boleyn is not forgotten. Her name is spoken across centuries, her face painted in portraits, her story taught in classrooms, written in novels, whispered in ghost tours. Henry VIII may have ordered her erased, but he failed. The sickest twist of all is that Anne's execution made her eternal. Today, when people walk through the Tower of London, they don't think of Henry's triumphs. They think of Anne's fall. They imagine her last steps onto the scaffold. They hear the silence before the sword. They feel the weight of her dignity, the terror of her injustice. Her death has become one of the most haunting executions in history, not because of how it ended, but because of how it echoes. Anne Boleyn's story reminds us of the darkest truth about power, that it can twist love into cruelty, justice into theater, life into legend. She was accused, condemned, humiliated, and beheaded, but in the end, she became more powerful in death than Henry ever was in life. And that is the most horrifying execution in history, not just because a queen lost her head, but because her silence still speaks louder than the king who killed her.